Hey, how's it going, everyone? I hope everyone had a very nice week. I hope everyone's done with midterms or at least like about to finish them up right about now. We have a super cool meeting for you guys today. We have a lot about startups, which I know it's a hot topic right now just because people are looking for different startup opportunities. So we got you covered. We brought in some experts that are going to help you guys kind of navigate that whole field. So we're super excited about that. And then I'm just going to get into some extra SVS updates, kind of what we're doing, what our plans are, and events coming up. So yeah, but I'll give it just 1 minute just to kind of let some people stroll in. Um, so how's everyone doing? If anyone's here yet. All right. Well, We'll start out just going over the weekly update for uh, just kind of like the news that's going around tech. So the first thing is that Slack proposes new features. So Slack is kind of looking for different ways to innovate. They're looking for ways to kind of like bring new users on. So they're really starting to kind of play around with the idea of video experiences, similar to like an Instagram stories. Um, I personally don't know how I feel about this kind of innovation, just because I think it is so tied to kind of work productivity, in my opinion. Although there are some personal Slack channels, but we'll see how they end up kind of navigating that and keeping that balance between like work as well as I guess some personal channels. Now, the second thing is Linktree raises Series B. So, Linktree, you guys probably have all seen it on Instagram, especially. It's a site that kind of allows you to have different links and kind of like have an ecosystem that you would want. And then you could put that in like your Instagram bio, so you really are able to have more than just one URL in your bio. Um, they help found like they're pretty much helped found their market, and now hold about 88% of their market share. We use Linktree. Honestly, it's a super easy thing to use, so I think that's definitely a plus for the company, just because anytime it's very uh, user friendly, that's obviously going to help drive up usage. And then the last thing is Snapchat launches Remix. So we've seen this now twice from some of the largest players to try to combat TikTok's success. They're kind of like doing their own thing. We saw it with Instagram Reels. Now Snapchat's kind of launching their Remix. Does anyone have any kind of ideas on who you think is going to end up taking this market? I don't know if anyone in chat uses like TikTok or uses Instagram Reels, but do you think anyone is better positioned than the others? Kenny thinks that TikTok is too established. I think that's a pretty good call. I mean, TikTok definitely does have like um, a really high like user total, and it's obviously like first to market, so they have some kind of advantages there. But I definitely think that I like the idea that Snapchat's doing it. I think Snapchat, in my opinion, is probably better off than Instagram, just only because I guess it's a little bit more of a relaxed social networking setting. So I think that could probably work there. So we're getting a lot of TikToks. IG Reels is just TikTok being reposted. That's pretty true. Jahao, I think that that's definitely an issue, and I think that Remix is going to see that also. And then also just kind of bringing up a topic that we had last week about Discord. So now it's really looking like there's a deal between Microsoft and Discord for about $10 billion. That's going to be huge, and we're going to see, hopefully we see some kind of integration with Discord into the Microsoft kind of tools that they use. So that could be like Microsoft Teams, Personally, I thought it would have been interesting to see if Amazon was going to get Discord just because they have their large video game, like their large streaming service primarily for video games, which is Twitch. So I thought those could have paired really well. But we'll see what Microsoft ends up doing with it. They could obviously put it into Xbox and see if they want to collab that way, but that's definitely going to be interesting. And then as for just a little bit more general updates, NYUVC, we have kicked off officially last week, and now we're getting teams. So please join. If you guys don't have a team, we can help you guys build a team. There's nothing to worry about there. And then if you guys can get a couple of your friends, teams of 3 or 4, and compete. It's nice. It's fun. It's a way to like kind of practice some of your skills. We'll be guiding you through the way, so it's not going to hopefully be too much work for it. But it's just some good experience. And then pitching in front of live VCs is obviously a super cool thing to do. So I recommend it. I competed in it a couple years ago and had a blast. So for sure, I would suggest that. The sign up is currently in our description for this event. There's the flyer which has all the facts and the sign up, and then there's also a link directly to the sign up. We also have like a new surprise. Hopefully, we're working with PDCE to get a networking session with venture capitalists. And then if you are participating in the competition, you will get priority access to that networking session, which will hopefully be like either one-on-ones or two-on-ones or 3-on-1s with real VCs and hopefully some hiring VCs. So that's just some general NYU VC updates. We'll have more to come, obviously, but that's it for now. The current sign-up date is April 7th. That's the date that you have to have your team in by, or at least have your own in by, so we can help you build a team. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our special guest today. It's Chain and Rishabh. They are going to talk to you about startups, how to pick the right startup, what is attractive in a startup. I'm super excited to hear what they have to say. They're super knowledgeable, so feel free, chat, to be super engaged and to kind of bounce some ideas off of them. You know, they're fully equipped to handle your questions, so have nothing to worry about there. And then after they're done with a little bit of a workshop, there's going to be a short Q&A session. So if you didn't get any questions out of the way, or there was no time to ask it during the workshop, for sure ask it during the Q&A session. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you guys. Rishabh, Chain, take it away. Super excited.
Hey guys, thanks for having us today. So we're Chain and Rishabh from Contrary, and we'll be speaking today about how to choose a startup and a few related topics. We have about 45 minutes, and so we'll dive right in. Excited to be here. So first of all, plug for Contrary. We are a VC fund working on campus that invests up to $500K in a startup. We usually proceed or pre-seed. We try to be the first institutional capital in. But honestly, we're just here to help you guys. You are our main sourcing market, which means that we want to engage with you as early as possible, even as early as, for example, this session, where I'm assuming you don't have any ideas for starting a company yet, but you might in 6 months, 12 months, even 24 months after you graduate. Like, we're really here to be supporters of early career talent. So get in touch if you are thinking about it. Here's our team. As you can see, we are Rishabh and Chain right in the middle. Lucas and Trey are also on the team, but they're not presenting today. So just a bit about me before I hand it over to Rishabh. My name is Chain. I'm a second-year MBA at Stern. Before Stern, I spent 2 years in consulting and 4 years as an entrepreneur. After Stern, I'll be working as an investor. So I have that sort of consulting, operator, and now investing experience that spans all those. As you can see, there are 2 startups I work for specifically that's relevant to today's conversation. So I'm happy to talk about which one went well, which one didn't. That was 4 years of my life. So happy to talk about that. And I'll hand it over to Rishabh to talk briefly about his background so that you can know what to ask him later.
Awesome. Thanks, Shane. Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Rishabh. Super excited to be here. Right now, I'm a senior. I study CS over at the college and then statistics at Stern. After graduating, I'll be working as a PM at a startup in San Francisco called Pathlight. But then during college, I did a few different engineering gigs. I worked as an engineer at a data management company called Palantir, and then at a health tech startup called Modern Health. And I also did a VC gig, analyst gig at a firm called NEA, which is a few blocks away from campus, actually. Cool. So first off, I want to kind of talk about, what our goals are with this talk, and then also what are not our goals. So what our goals are is like 1, understanding, okay, like what are the benefits of working at a startup? And then 2, okay, understanding how can I mitigate the risks associated with startup work? And then finally, we'll talk about some interesting frameworks about how to actually choose, a promising company. What this is not going to be focused on is explaining the different roles or explaining deep into the interview process or compensation. This is stuff you guys can easily find online, but if you have any other questions about it, feel free to ask us at the end of this talk. Cool. Kind of starting right off with our agenda. First thing I want to do is kind of bust some myths that are involved with working with startups. The first myth there is, and this is especially kind of predominant at very pre-professional schools like an NYU, for example, are that startups are for people who can't like work at FANG or MBB or whatever acronym you want to insert. And that's simply not true, right? Like I have a lot of my most talented friends like turn down FANG offers, prestigious things like software engineering at Facebook, Google APM, so that they could work at startups. And the reason for that is there's a couple major benefits here, and I've tried to list them roughly in order of importance here. First and foremost is at a startup, 9 times out of 10, you're just going to get more learning and more impact, right? Like you'll be staffed on higher impact projects. You won't be siloed into a specific type of role. So you'll really get to, learn from all the different departments. The second thing is you'll build emotional resilience. And what I mean by this is if you work for a big company, it's a really de-risk situation, right? You can't screw up, like they're not going to put you on anything where you can screw up. And as a result, it's always kind of static. As opposed to at a startup, like you are on the line, like you are exposed to both the highs and the lows of the company. So I think like building emotional resilience is something that's like pretty under indexed on. And as college students, like we haven't had the chance to do it too often, right? Like at school, there's really no consequences for our actions. So I think this is actually like a really important thing to learn early in your career, especially. And this ties nicely into the third point. Working at a startup is an incredible training if you want to become a founder one day, right? Like you'll be able to work closely with the founder. You'll be able to experience the whole process of starting a company, everything from product ideation to delivery, shipping it, to iterating. So that's a really good point. And then finally, if you get lucky and if you choose the right startup, you can have potentially outsized returns that would far outstrip anything that a big company will pay you. So these are some of the core benefits. I think another myth with startups and working at startups is that the compensation is very bad. That's also not true. If you choose a good startup that's well-funded and promising, your base will often be very competitive with what the big companies are offering you. Now, I will say that the downsides are that your equity is not liquid, right? And usually there's no signing bonus. But also your equity is not liquid, but it has the potential to appreciate greatly. So these are just things to consider. The last myth that people have with regards to startups is that it's a lottery of sorts in terms of picking the right one. And that's simply not true. It is true to say that 95% of startups are not worth your time. And that's just the fact of the matter. 95% of startups are going to bust. They don't attract great talent. They're not solving really interesting problems. You're better off going to FANG in that case, or any big company. But it is also true that there are very clear indicators and like signals that you can look for to identify those top 5%, those top 1% of startups that will win in a big way. So Shane is actually going to go ahead and, kind of tell you some of those signals to look for. But before revealing our secrets, would love for you guys to kind of type in the chat, what's your thought process right now? So on the stream, go ahead and take a few moments to type in which factors you think you'd use to figure out which startups are promising or that you'd be interested in working at. Things like location, compensation, investors, industry, team, stuff like that. Yeah, so just take a few moments right now to do that. All right, cool. We got founding team, investors, team, compensation, amount raised. Yep, these are all really great factors. Give it a few more moments. Yep, team, investors, compensation. Cool. Yeah, these are all really great factors to kind of index on. Yep, product, founding team, exactly. Yeah, so I'll kind of hand it over to Chain now, and he's going to talk about some of the other things that are important to look for. So
Yeah, thanks for that, Rishabh. Do you want to share the screen again? I'm just looking at the stream, and I think that's great. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. So I'm preparing this presentation. I was thinking more about the role of the things that you probably are not thinking about. And the first thing I want to say is just, will the company exist in 2 years? And there's a couple of ways to look at this. You've already got a couple on here. There's the founding team, the investors, the product, the markets. But I wanted to put it into crystal clear profile for you to what it looks like for someone who has worked at 2 startups and what that means 2 years and 4 years on respectively on those experiences, right? So I worked for 2 startups, and one raised about $500 million. I joined with seed, so that was pretty much a rocket ship, and the other didn't. And there's a really clear difference in terms of how people perceive these 2 startups. I joined very early on in both, so less than 20 people in both cases. So what we're trying to do here is I'm trying to look at how you can diligence a company and whether or not it will exist in 2 years. The first thing I would say is an early hires profile. I think it's something that you guys mentioned in team, but in particular, I don't think that here it's about necessarily the founding team. It's more about, because the founding team, they're always going to be okay, right? Like they raise the money, they have their downside risk sort of truncated. Typically, they came from a better paying job, and they can probably, because they're the founder, have a good profile to jump into it. But the people who are really taking the risks more than often than not are people like you, and people who were hired early on. So think about that first product hire, think about that first engineer. Where did they come from? If that person who was a Google PM before, and she took a pay cut to come join this company, then you probably should be thinking twice about the company in terms of how that it could be a really good opportunity. But in the same vein, though, you have to look at how long they've stayed. So if you know that the company is founded 24 months ago, right? And then you actually see people have only been there for 3 months, it means that the tenure weren't very long. And again, it's like the way to proxy what you probably won't like and what probably led other people to leave. The second thing is the lead investors. And here it's a twofold sort of effect. The first thing is that once you have a good lead investor in this round, they're going to be the people who are going to be bringing on and warm introing investors to the next round, which just helps with the existential risk of being able to raise a new round. That's the first thing. But the second thing is also that you can do as much DD as you want on the product, on what you think the market size is for this company, but you won't have as much information as the lead investor had when she invested during the DD process there. So the prestige is a great indicator, and they're your typical names as Excel, A16Z, well, actually that's less so, but Greylock, Sequoia, all these companies have a great track record, and they would have had access to information that you don't. Number 3 is customers. I'm just not going to go too much on here because that's kind of obvious. Next slide, please, Rishabh. And this is something that I really wish I knew when I was joining a startup. And I don't know if any of you have mentioned this specifically in the chat, but I am quoting Hamilton here when I say the room where it happens. And what I mean by that is when you're joining a startup, right, you're really foregoing a lot of things, sometimes for good reasons. So you're probably not going to get the prestige that a McKinsey job brings you 2 years from now, and the stability as well. So what you really, really want is you want learnings, right? And specifically what I understood by learning in my career is access to key discussions. Because you really want to be in the room in the first 100 days of Instagram when they decided that retweeting or resharing wasn't going to be a product feature. That discussion is going to be a very interesting discussion that you would not have access to if you just weren't in the room, right? Same thing with, in my experience, hiring and firing decisions. A lot of junior people don't have access to that. And that actually drives a lot of what a company does and how successful it is. So that's why the room where it happens really matters here. And that's literally being in the room or in the Zoom room. So I'm going back to the chart that's here. I want to say that basically the room where it happens is always available to the founder, right? So you're going to n equals 1 when you join the company, that means you're the founder, and that's always good. But that discussion and the ability to decide and have an influence in that discussion trails off significantly after the founder just started, because studies show that the maximum number of people that someone can directly manage is 8 effectively. And if you think about it, the founder actually knows much more than you do. She's probably thought about it a lot more. She's a lot more invested. She probably has access to knowledge and mentors that you don't. So she probably is in the best position to make all the choices in your company up until 8 people. And that effect sort of trails on up until I think about 20 people. It depends on the company. Obviously, some companies are more labor intensive than others. This is illustrative. But there will be a point up to which the founder will always micromanage. And you want to get in at the point just beyond that. Because if I'm thinking about underclassmen at NYU in the undergrad program, you're probably not going to join as a CMO anywhere. So you're probably, your best bet is to have access to key discussions because you are direct manager. So maybe the CMO, the first senior marketing or product hire, was given autonomy to actually decide on it. And so that's what explains the sharp drop after the founder just founded the company. And it rises a little bit after the CEO decides that, oh, I actually can't do anything and I have to focus my time on something, and then I have to delegate decision-making responsibilities to N-1. And obviously, the learnings and the access to key discussions is almost non-existent in a very large company, because you definitely would not be in any hiring or firing rooms until maybe you're 5 years into the job. You certainly will not be deciding which investors get on board. You certainly don't want to be deciding key product decisions because you're too junior in a 200-person company. So this is the second thing I wish I knew about. And obviously the way to diligence this is partly, and in a very imperfect way, it's a number of employees in the company. But more effectively is probably, is your manager the kind of person who will bring you along in that room? So doing due diligence on your manager is probably more important actually than doing due diligence on the founder. and probably more important than due diligence on the product itself. So next slide, please, Rishabh. Yeah, so this is you.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Jane. Yeah, so now that we've kind of talked a little bit about, specific factors to look at in an individual startup, you might be asking, okay, cool. What are some interesting spaces where there's a lot of like compelling startups? And, the way we think about this isn't by industry. We don't think, oh, let's look at fintech startups. Let's look at health tech startups. Rather, we take a thesis-driven approach, right? We go a step deeper and we use these theses not only as investors to figure out where we should deploy capital, but we use them to figure out where we should deploy our labor as employees, which is arguably more important. So I'll kind of just walk you through a couple of these investment theses, and then we can talk about them at the end. Cool. So the first thesis is around infrastructure. So whenever you're looking at different industries, you'll notice some trends that are happening. The idea here is don't go following the trends, right? Rather, go a level deeper and think to yourself, okay, what tools are the people who are following the trends? What tools will they need? And let me build those tools and sell it to them. It's kind of like the way that during the gold rushes, the people who made all the money weren't the actual miners. It's rather the people who sold them the picks and shovels. So, go ahead and sell the picks and shovels. I know this sounds a little nebulous, so let's try to apply this thesis to a couple of different industries. Starting off, we'll look at applying this infrastructure thesis to fintech. There's a lot of compelling fintech startups right now, Robinhood, Coinbase, Stripe, all of them. But if we look at one trend in fintech, it's interesting in that almost a lot of different companies that aren't traditional financial service companies are starting to offer financial services as a way to further monetize upon their customers and to increase retention. We call this trend embedded fintech, right? Companies that aren't traditional financial service providers are offering them. Now, that all sounds great and well, but the problem is, if financial services aren't your core competency, it's really hard to start offering them. And so there's an entire new class of companies that are starting to bubble up that are all meant to build tools that allow other companies to start offering financial services. To give some concrete examples here, let's look at credit cards. A bunch of different companies have started to realize that issuing their own credit cards are a great way to achieve, almost riskless profit by taking a cut of the transaction fees. Uber is obviously a big name that did this. The thing is, issuing your own credit card, it's hard. There's a lot of regulation involved, a lot of steps to jump over. So a company like Marqeta has built a white label solution that allows any company to start issuing its own brand of credit cards. So that's a great infrastructure play. Another example would be Quip, that direct-to-consumer electric toothbrush company that has pop-ups in Soho sometimes. They start to realize, hey, let's start offering our customers dental insurance. And because our customers are more likely to have good dental hygiene, we can actually offer them cheaper rates. But again, offering insurance is difficult. So a company like Tint has come into play, and I think they were actually part of the recent YC batch. Gusto, the human resources software, another great example. They had all this payment data about how much people were getting paid and how often, and they use that data to underwrite loans. Obviously, underwriting loans is hard, so you turn to a company like Sivo. And then the last example here is a lot of vertical SaaS companies, like a Toast, for example, or a MindBody. Toast is like that POS system for restaurants. They realized that, hey, we can I think Toast quadrupled their market cap or something by becoming a POS system by processing payments. But again, becoming your own POS provider is very difficult. So then we turn to a company called Phoenix. So every example here you see, it's a non-financial services company, rideshare, goddamn toothbrushes, right? And they start to offer financial services via this infrastructure. So let's actually apply this whole infrastructure thesis to one more industry. let's look at e-commerce. It's interesting. I was once talking to an underclassman who was really interested in e-commerce. So they were thinking, oh, maybe I should work for a Glossier or an Omsom or some great D2C brand. And I said, that's definitely one way to go. But think about it a little deeper. Think about e-commerce, all the different steps involved, everything from discovering the product to starting a subscription to paying for it to dealing with customer service. And every step in the process, there's an absolute plethora of infrastructure companies that are servicing all the tens of thousands of direct-to-consumer companies out there. So I think if you really want to learn about e-commerce and direct-to-consumer, yes, one way is to work for a great company, but another way is to work for a great platform and infrastructure company that's empowering so many direct-to-consumer companies. I think that's a great way to kind of get a 30,000-foot view of the industry. Cool. So that's the first thesis around infrastructure. The second thesis is around developer tools. And by developer tools, I specifically mean tools for like software engineers and data scientists and data engineers. There's a couple of reasons we as investors really are interested in developer tools, and it's a space that's getting a lot of attention right now. The reason these kinds of tools are so compelling is, number one, the value add is very quantifiable and just honestly huge, right? Engineers are the highest salaried workers for pretty much any company. So if you can come into the office and say to your client and say, hey, I can save your engineers 1 hour of time a month, the software pays for itself, right? If 1 hour of engineering time is worth like $100, right, the software will pay for itself instantly. So it's very easy to kind of make a very quantifiable value add. The second thing we really like about developer tools is there's a really compelling go-to-market strategy with them. Recently, an incredible trend is that developers have more power over the purse. What I mean by that is that developers are able to buy the tools that they want to use. You don't necessarily need to go through the office of the CIO anymore. And this means that sales cycles are much shorter for developer tools than with traditional enterprise SaaS products. So that's very compelling. Also, you can use things like open source to you can open source your technologies to achieve like almost consumer-like virality. So it's definitely very tempting from that aspect. And the third aspect is there is a degree of network effects involved with developer communities, especially in tight-knit communities like in San Francisco or New York, for example, because developers love to brag about the tools they like to use. And whenever they hop ship to a different company, they want to use those same tools. And so they'll become almost evangelists for your product, no matter what company they like. So for these reasons, we really find this entire space to be very compelling. And I think that's why a lot of investors are paying a lot of attention to it. In terms of thinking about, okay, within developer tools, how should I position myself? There's two major flavors here of startups to kind of consider. One is kind of the low code, no code idea. And that's the whole idea that, okay, these are tools that allow even non-engineers to make like incredible products and tools for their business, right? So things like Airtable, Notion, Retool, all fantastic companies. The other way is to think a little deeper. And again, look at the trends that are happening in software engineering and infrastructure, things that are going around in data infrastructure, in machine learning tooling, in microservice development. And then again, build the businesses that will service that. And data infrastructure, especially right now, is an area that's receiving a whole lot of attention from VCs. So that's a very compelling area where a lot of really cool startups are emerging. The last thesis we have is kind of around the data lake. And the general crux of this thesis is you want to find disparate data sources in any industry that has a lot of fragmented data. Your software wants to be able to unify them, all that data together in like almost a data lake, and then expose that data meaningfully via several applications. Keith Raboy, who's a partner at Founders Fund, he says that trying to find a formula for startup success is kind of a fool's errand. But if there was one, he would probably think this pattern is it. Working in a very fragmented industry and delivering like a vertical SaaS solution for it. He thinks that this is kind of the formula that has led to a disproportionate number of big wins. I know this sounds kind of vague, so let me try to illustrate it a little bit clearer. When you think about this model, right, your software should take data from any industry and that's very fragmented across either other SaaS providers or different databases, unify it all together, and then expose it in meaningful apps. And the great thing is you can take this kind of formula, this kind of model, and apply it to every industry and make massively valuable companies. So Palantir, for example, built a $40 billion company by using this model for government and industrial data. Ribbon Health, which is like a really cool startup that I think just got funding from Andreessen, and they do this for doctor information, right? They amalgamate all this doctor information together into one data lake and then expose it to their customers via APIs. Segment does the exact same thing for customer data, and Pathlight does it for performance data. So I know that's a lot that kind of came at you. So just as a summary before we move on and finish up, the things that Shane and I really want you to take away from this whole talk is, one, think about like, why do you want to work at startups, right? The reason shouldn't be, oh, I want to get rich. Like, yeah, that's cool if it happens, but that's not a guarantee. Rather, you should really be optimizing for your learning, thinking about, how can you get in those in the room conversations that Shane was talking about? How can you optimize for your network? So when you want to build a company, people you'll have like the founders and people you work with. And also, I think it's just great training if you want to be a founder. The second major takeaway is like thinking about how to choose a company. Really important that you have like good investors, because they know way more about the company than you do, and a really great team, right? And if they're able to attract top level talent, that's a great sign. And then also the customers, right? If the customers are in love with the product, then there's a strong signal that there's good product market fit and there's something here. And then finally, we talked about these investment theses around infrastructure, around developer tools, and around this data lake. Obviously, there's so many more investment theses out there, but these are just a couple examples that are kind of meant to kind of show you as investors how we think about different startups. And feel free to kind of make your own investment theses, and that'll help you guide, which startup you want to work for. So with that, this is our contact information. We'll also put it in the chat. But with that, we can just kind of take questions. Shane, if there's anything else you want to add.
No, happy to take questions.
Yeah, so we can open this up to chat. So chat, if you're interested, you have anything you want to ask them, feel free to put it in and I'll just bounce it towards them. And then let's just quickly start off with just like general questions in the meantime. So for both of you, actually, is there advice that you would tell either your freshman self or yourself when you were first starting to look at startups, something you would go back and wish you knew?
Yeah, do you want to do that one first, Rishabh?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess when I was a freshman, I really indexed on the power. I really underappreciated on the power of cold emailing. Like I had this notion that, okay, if I want a job, it has to be either through campus recruiting or it has to be like a company with like a known application out there, like something that I see on LinkedIn, for example. Well, what I realized is a lot of the best opportunities aren't made public, right? So the way you access them is you have to find interesting companies and really just cold email the founders, the engineers, the product managers there and say, hey, I'm really interested. These are my credentials. This is a piece that shows how I've thought about the industry and the business. And you'll be surprised how like helpful that is. I've gotten 2 jobs just by cold emailing people. So I think that's my biggest kind of piece of advice. Shane, do you have anything else to add on?
Yeah. So I guess mine would be less about how to find it and more about how to think about it. I mean, I think that sometimes at the tail end of a year, when you have done so many recruiting processes, you feel like you are, you just take any job. But actually, I think that still the startup recruiting process is still a buyer's market, and the buyers are the candidates. So I think I would keep that in mind. You're going to be adding a lot of value if you did a lot of work thinking about why this company, and you would have done internships before. So yeah, I would actually wait to get into the right startup And I think obviously this is for underclassmen mostly, but for even for upperclassmen, if you graduate without a job, I would say even wait a while, because that first full-time job is really important. And it is a buyer's market. So, and the buyers are you.
All right, awesome answers. So James just asked in the chat, thesis validation is a long, intensive process. What are some of the ways you guys approach it?
So I guess like the way to think about this is really just being empirical, both in terms of your personal experiences and then also in terms of just like looking at what startups are successful. So honestly, just looking at a lot of case studies and trying to understand like, okay, does your thesis work there? And if there's exceptions, like why did those occur? So honestly, like the whole data lake thesis is something that I created when I was working at Palantir. And it was because I was like trying to understand, okay, like what is the formula? Like why is this company so successful? And this is something that gradually started to take shape. I wasn't convinced that, okay, is this necessarily, can you necessarily repeat this process? But then I kept on seeing other companies that follow the same basic structure. And it's honestly this thesis that also helped me figure out the startup that I want to work at full time. So obviously nothing is foolproof, but it's really just about, looking at a lot of examples and looking at like a lot of startups and what has won and what hasn't and why. So that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think that it's very hard for me to find a thesis that really works. So I think that a lot of people feel like they have to figure it out all on their own. And I just think that that's very inefficient. So I would just ask people. I would ask investors, I would ask friends, I would ask people working at companies. I think that there's way too little hustle, generally speaking, in the recruitment process and in thesis generation. You would be surprised how many people just want to talk about their company all day and what the competitors are doing and what they're doing right. And is there a niche within this market that it's not fulfilled? So yeah, I think I found it harder when I was younger because I felt like I had to know all the answers because I felt like I had nothing to add if I didn't have all the answers. But actually asking questions like a beginner is one of the most important skills that I've learned, and I think I hope to have that beginner mindset for a long time more, because I found that, so I'm going into investing after this, and one of the investors I admire most in my company, like she literally, she's from Thailand as well, actually out in Thailand. She has a bit of an accent. She is a she, and a lot of people just underestimate her, and she asks all these like really basic questions, but her portfolio is like boss. It's just insanely good. So I think back to the question, how do you formulate a thesis? I think asking simple questions is actually quite hard, more emotionally than anything else. And I think it's something that you can do, and it's going to make it really much more efficient.
So then on a similar note about like asking people, reaching out to people, Ishan asks, when you're cold emailing, who do you reach out to? And then what do you think are the most essential parts of that cold email?
Shane, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I actually was just talking about Richard about this today because I was just asking each of the questions, and then like a question I asked myself is like I'd hired a lot in my previous roles, and what makes me really perk up is a cold email. Cold emails are just the best when it's done well. I would prioritize a good cold email any day over like a McKinsey BA or like a Google APM. It's like, oh my God, like this person is finally paying attention. So I think it's just reading out from your question, who do you reach out to at different startups? So I would reach out to the person who would have a hiring manager role. So if you're applying for like a junior PM, I would apply to the PM, or I would cold email the PM. If there's an HR person, I probably wouldn't do that because they don't have knowledge expertise, and they won't get as excited about the company as someone working in like marketing, and you're specifically addressing a marketing thing in your email. So I would reach out to specific hiring managers. So this is probably not the CMO. If it's like a 100-person startup, it's probably one level below. So the person who will be interviewing you for the first round, basically, is the person you should be reaching out to. And what do you include in the email for the greatest chances? Honestly, there's no substitute for time. I do a lot of cold emailing when I was applying for venture capital funds to work for, and there's just literally no estimate. There's no substitute for just reading everything about the portfolio company, saying like which ones you like best. If it's a product, and if you're applying for PM, you should try the product, say what you think is the thing that you would improve on. And yeah, just like very specific content that gets that person specifically excited. So it's different for a marketing person, it's different for a PM, it's different yet if you're applying for like a VC role, right? So just you have to really tailor it to that person. And unfortunately, there's no substitute for time. Yeah.
And then last question in the chat right now we have from Alex. He's asking, are there any books or podcasts that you guys recommend for those who want to enter the startup space?
I mean,
You go first, Richard?
I can list a couple that I really like. I think A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz, I think they're just absolutely money in terms of like the whole venture media game. Like the amount of different podcasting assets they have is crazy. So anything by Andreessen Horowitz, and like all their essays and articles are really good. I find whenever I'm trying to understand an industry better, I usually will look at their thoughts, their industry maps to get a better lay of the land. In terms of other things to read, so I would say maybe books a little less, but like all these different venture capitalists have such good like Substacks or Twitters or Mediums. Just follow them because they have such brilliant insights. Like these guys spend their entire day, their entire job is just like looking at interesting startups and creating theses. So just like look at them and what they have to say, and that'll help you not only shape your own theses, but also give you a list of like interesting startups and spaces to look at. So combination of like both the Substacks and then I think just Andreessen Horowitz is pretty fire.
Can I add a caveat to that?
Yeah,
because
go for
I
it.
spend like so much time reading this stuff.
Yeah.
I think and A16Z is very good for first cut, but they're very bad for anything after that. So like, for example, like a good framework that you brought in today's presentation was like the no code versus like little code kind of distinction, right? Like that kind of stuff. You can go to A16Z all day. However, if you are really looking deeply at a startup, and especially if you are thinking about spending your most expensive capital, which is your time, on a startup, I would not trust any of these guys because they have an incentive to lie to you, right? The problem with VCs and media more generally is that, a bit like Facebook, if you're not paying for the product, venture capitalists have an incentive to promote themselves and the portfolio companies they work for. For example, I used to read a lot USV's VC, and over time I just realized that like maybe 1 in 10 of those are insightful, but 9 out of 10 of those are promotional. So I would +1 on A16Z, but I would say that you can't just rely on that. I think that you have to pay for something, or you have to make sure that there are no incentives to get into the truth that conflicts with your incentives. So I definitely think Stratechery is very, very good because you're paying for it. So you have no other incentive apart from telling you the truth. I think that any Substack where it's not an established VC or an aspiring VC is good. For example, an operator who is just like passionate about what she does and does not want to sell to someone. So with VCs, right? You have to understand that the only reason they're publishing these media is to get in front of founders, and that's who they're setting to. Which means that their content is very limited in terms of they don't want to say the wrong thing, right? Because So I literally was working on an investment thesis with a VC, and he was like, "Oh yeah, you can say this, but I can't, because if I say this, I'll piss off some fintech founders. So they will never really give you a clear answer, basically. So like, for example, I was gonna slam Lemonade, basically, and then he was like, "Oh, I'm investing in the space. I can't do that." So yeah, I would be really conscious about what you're reading, if that reading is important to you, as in when you're making an important choice like joining a startup. But I'll just keep it there.
Yeah, thank you for letting us know that. So we got another question from James. He's asking, what do you guys look for in founders raising capital?
That's a great question. So yeah, especially at the stage of investing that we do, contrary, which is like seed and pre-seed, the founding team is the most important factor. And Contrary does have a very high standard. Like most funds that invest at our stage will invest in like 40 companies a year. We invest in like a dozen tops. I'd say natural factors is the single most important thing is they need to be like really good, or like one, they need to be just an incredible storyteller, right? They need to be able to really sell their vision. So that'll help them not only raise future funds, future rounds, but also convince top talent to join them. So storytelling is probably the most important thing. Another great indicator is like, had they just been like really exceptional at something before, even if it's not related, like whether it's a sport, like an instrument or whatever, if they're really exceptional at something, like that is a good indicator that they can channel that energy into something that they really care about. So I'd say storytelling and then just being like really exceptional at something kind of makes that next level founder that Contrary looks for. Shane, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah. So I think at the stage we're investing, which is pre-seed and seed, you're trying to assess things that are not there yet, right? So you're trying to hope that there's traction in the future. So I think one thing that Rishit mentioned is being exceptional at something before. And for me, what that signals at is good time management and commitment to something. Another thing that I think Rishit mentioned that I will mention is good storytelling capabilities. So if you can't tell a good story or a good pitch to me within our first one or sometimes maybe two conversations, it's unlikely that you'll be able to convince an employee to join who's very well qualified and convince like this Google PM to quit her job and join your startup, right? And that kind of selling is really important because that's what determines the success of the company. So storytelling capabilities is something that I look for a lot. And their ability to answer questions well is a parallel to that, but yeah.
Great answers from both of you guys. Chat, if you still have any questions, feel free to send them in. I'll ask you guys a question for both of you guys. If while you're looking back at your past experiences, do you think you chose the right startups to work for?
Shane, I know we both have had our share of misses. I can take this off. I've definitely made a lot of mistakes, to be honest. My freshman year, the startup I worked for is fine. Like it still exists, but it hasn't really grown. Honestly, I just took it because that was my only option. So I don't know, I worked there. Sophomore year, I had a couple options. I still made a bad mistake, and the company I worked for ended up going bust like 6 weeks after I left. And the reason that I joined that startup is because I was like, oh, I'm really interested in fintech. So this is a fintech startup. I'm going to work for it. And that was a really bad decision, right? So that, again, kind of plays this point that you just don't want to look at industry. You want to think about things at a slightly deeper level. I think after getting burnt a few times, I started to kind of hone my thought process. And, the startup I worked for junior year was really good. I was almost considering going back there full time, but they did really well. And hopefully the decision I made going full time is also going to be good. But it's a trial and burn process, so you keep on iterating on your thought frameworks. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I did So it's a mixed bag, right? It's not really like always all good, and it's not always all bad. So I'll talk about the one that's been very helpful for me in my recruiting process. So the company I joined was called Zilingo, and it raised, as I mentioned, about $500 million. And I joined in seed, and the reason why I joined is because Sequoia seeded their seed round. And that was very, very good. And the company did really well. However, I didn't really get access to the room where it happens. So yeah, it was very good for marketing purposes, and it was good for learning purposes, but it wasn't as good as it could have been. That was my best outcome.
Another question for both of you guys. Where do you see yourselves in like a few years, maybe like 5 years down the road? Do you think you'll still be working with startups?
Jane, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I've signed off to the startup world, to be honest. I will be working for a mutual fund covering small caps, so basically startups that just IPO'd after I graduate, and the average tenure of this company is about 18 years. So if I am just average, I probably will stay there a long time. And that's literally, I haven't heard anyone say that ever. Like 18 years is insane. It's probably like unfathomable for a lot of underclassmen, but yeah, so.
Yeah, it's interesting for me, like 5 years from now, I definitely do see myself still working with startups. Because like during college, I was chasing like the prestige rat race at first, trying to get into unicorns and stuff. And after I worked there, I didn't find it super fulfilling. And I definitely realized that I liked working on small teams. I also just think like I learned the most there. So at least for the part of my, like at least the majority of my 20s, like I want to work with startups and build really cool products. And that's kind of what gets me up in the morning. So yeah, I do see myself doing that.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. Chat, if there's something still on your mind, feel free to send it in. We'll stick around for just a few more minutes. But Rishabh and Shane, it was really nice having you come on and like talk about startup recruiting. Do you have any like last words you want to leave with our audience?
I think networking is really, really important. I was just listening to Rishabh talk about his experience, and I think that the reason, and I might be putting words in your mouth, Rishabh, but I feel like the reason why he's a little bit more comfortable going into startups is that he has a pretty good network with venture capitalists, and that means his liquidity in any subsequent job search is probably very high. So I think networking is really, really important, and just getting in the right doors, having people know you, and having people know you as a great early career talent. So I would say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really fair. Like networking is super important. Definitely gives you options. Like if you know top investors, right, then even if the company you're working for in their portfolio doesn't work out, they can plug you into another company that's working really well. So the company that I'm going to be working at, I got introduced to by the investors of the last company that I worked at. So that's kind of, case in point right there. If I were to say anything else, like kind of looking back at it, I would say like the way to think about your career, like the way that's often thought about your career is as a ladder, right? You move linearly from one big company or one step to the next step. I'm going to be a software engineer 2, then software engineer 3, then PM or engineering manager, whatever. But if you treat your career as a ladder, you will only grow linearly. If you want to get outsized results in the long term, then you need to treat your career as a game. And a game, to be successful, like Monopoly, for instance, you spend the early part of your career gathering a lot of resources, building networks. And then in the later part of your career, you can leverage that and attain outsized results. So really, I know that's like a kind of contrived metaphor, but that's the way that I am thinking about my early career as I'm moving on to my first job. I don't know if Pathlight's going to become like a $10 billion company. I hope so. Like that would be great. But I do know that I can learn a lot and build some pretty compelling networks that I can leverage later on. So that's the way that I consider it. Last thing is, I know like your first job can always be very intimidating, or your junior internship, you're like, oh, this is what matters so much. But again, you need to treat life as a marathon, and like I said, as a game. And in a game, people can always, get ahead and then get behind, right? So your first job is important from what you learn from it, but even if it's not like everything you want, even if it's not your dream job, quote unquote, you'll be surprised by just how far you can go with that right mindset. So that's what I'd say.
So it looks like your last words actually sparked one more question. This will just be the last one that we cover before wrapping up. But James is asking, what are some of your suggestions to develop and maintain your network, especially when you're starting out?
So one great advice that I actually have, and this is actually something that I did with Pathlight, is if you're interested, once I got connected with their investors, I went another step. And I literally emailed one of their PMs and I was like, hey, I'm super interested in your product. This is a product review that I wrote about one of your products. And here are some of the errors that I found in it. And here's some ways that I think can be improved. That level of initiative is just like super compelling to anyone. So if you're interested in the company, don't just cold email them and say, I'm so-and-so, I'm interested, because like, quite honestly, we're undergrads. Like you're not going to be that value add from your skills. You're going to be value add from the time and your passion. So if you can show like an example, like, hey, here is a redesign I made on Figma of your landing page or one of your products, or here's like some strategy I thought about, right? That's really compelling. And that will probably get you, at least a phone call. So that's what I'd say. It's more time intensive, but I think the yield is much greater.
Well, thank you guys again for coming. Just a few more things for people on stream. Make sure you click the attendance link. It's in our description. And also, if you're interested in participating in NYUVC, the description and sign up is also in the channel description below. So I think that's everything for today. So yeah, thank you guys. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Put this to an end. Then I see you, here we go again. So let's have a drink, or one too many. It's like a dream, and we've got plenty of catching up to do. Has the year been kind to you? I've grown so used to your touch, I can feel it, it's already upon me. But my mind deceives me. Take me so much higher, no need for a lighter, just to burn my heart out when you pour it all out. No, I don't believe it. You and I've been running around this town, now you leave it. And just before we could do everything we wanted to, in the moonlight where we're trying to, everybody knows that you're the only one who's golden for me. If you go your way, I'll go mine. See you in another life. Nothing's changed for me. What about you? Do you still feel it too? I've grown so used to your touch, I can feel it, it's already upon me. But my mind deceives me. Take me so much higher, no need for a lighter, just to burn my heart